London, 1837. The city is growing faster than it can understand itself. Gas lamps flicker along narrow streets. Fog settles low, swallowing sound. And between the houses, in the spaces where light doesn't quite reach, something begins to move. At first, it just talks. A whisper passed between servants. A rumour in taverns. A strange story told too late at night to dismiss completely. Something is out there. Not a man, not quite. A figure that doesn't walk, but leaps. That doesn't run, but vanishes. A thing with claws, with burning eyes, with a face people struggle to describe without invoking something inhuman. And then the story changes, because it stops being something people heard about and becomes something people survive. Welcome back to the Eclectic, where we explore the strange, the unsettling, and the stories that refuse to stay buried in history. Tonight's episode takes us into the streets of Victorian London, a city of industry, fear, invention, and imagination. Because sometimes the most enduring monsters are not born from one event. They are built from rumour, from panic, from the press, from something real stretched into something else. This is the story of Spring-Heeled Jack, a figure who terrified London, eluded capture, defied explanation, and may never have been just one man. All. To understand Spring-Heeled Jack, you have to understand London in the 1830s. This was not a calm, orderly city. It was expanding rapidly, overcrowded, uneven, unpredictable. Old villages were being swallowed by urban sprawl. Communities that once felt rural were now sitting on the edge of something industrial and unfamiliar. And with that came anxiety. Crime was rising, or at least being reported more often. The press was growing more aggressive. Stories spread faster than ever before. And perhaps most importantly, people were living closer together, but trusting each other less. Women, especially, were vulnerable. Servants walking home alone, young women crossing commons at dusk, domestic workers moving between households in the early morning or late evening. They were visible, accessible, and often unprotected. This matters because Spring-Heeled Jack didn't appear randomly. He appeared where fear already existed. You need to remember that in the 1830s, London was the largest city in the world, with a population nearing 2 million. This decade marked a critical transition as the city grappled with the rapid, often disorientating effects of industrialization and the first major waves of mass urbanization. And while violent crime was actually on a long-term decline, public perception, driven by printed accounts, suggested a growing social crisis. The 1830s saw a knowledge is power movement with a surge in affordable, often radical publications. Between 1830 and 1836, there were 56 radical newspapers launched, often bypassing stamp duty to reach the working classes. Early forms of crime reporting and penny dreadfuls began to transport readers into the underworld, later influencing the birth of the detective fiction. And while the Times remained the most powerful daily, its high price kept it out of reach for ordinary people, fueling the demand for cheaper alternatives. The urbanization of London also created a crisis of experience as residents adapted to increased nervous stimuli and the density of modern life in an ever-changing city. London was simultaneously celebrated as a place of progress and grieved as a site of ugliness and social estrangement. Respectable women faced significant social restrictions, as their presence in public was often seen as an invasion or a threat to gender control. And there was deep-seated fear regarding the difficulty of differentiating ordinary women from sex workers in crowded urban settings, leading to stricter policing of female solicitation and morality. The earliest reports of Spring Hill Jack don't even mention the name. They speak instead of something more vague. A ghost, an imp, a devil. Something seen in the outskirts of London, Barnes, East Sheen, suburban villages that sat just beyond the city's dense core. Descriptions vary wildly. Some say it looked like a man. Others say something animal-like, a bear, a bull, but the pattern is consistent. Women being approached, startled, grabbed, and then gone. No clear identity, no capture, and no explanation. At this stage, it's not yet a legend. It's something more fragile, a pattern without a name. Then comes one of the first widely repeated accounts, a young servant girl named Mary Stevens, in late 1837. She is walking near Clapham Common, a stretch of land that even today carries an uneasy reputation after dark. And then, suddenly, something steps out. Not walking, not approaching normally, but appearing. She later describes being grabbed, held tightly, unable to move. Hands, or something like hands, clutching at her clothes, tearing, scratching. She describes them as claw-like, cold, unnatural. The figure doesn't speak clearly. It doesn't demand money. It doesn't try to rob her. Instead, it does something stranger. It lingers, as if the fear itself is the point. And then she screams. And just like that, it's gone. Not running away, but leaping. The next day, something even stranger happens. A carriage travelling near the same area is suddenly interrupted. A figure, possibly the same one, leaps into its path. The horses panic, the carriage overturns, the driver is injured. Witnesses claim the attacker escapes by jumping over a wall, not climbing, not scrambling, but clearing it in a single bound, 9 feet at least, and laughing. The detail matters, because fear spreads differently when it includes something that feels theatrical, something that seems to enjoy being seen. News of the incident spread rapidly via word of mouth and the press, which eventually coined the name Spring Hill Jack. For the penny dreadful newspapers, the event was a primary inspiration for sensationalist literature, appearing in early 1838 pamphlets, and later the penny dreadful serials that established Jack as a popular Victorian bogeyman. By early 1838, the panic has grown. Letters are sent to officials, complaints reach the Home Secretary, the press become involved, and with the press comes something powerful. A name, Spring Hill Jack. It's perfect, memorable, visual, sensational. And once a thing has a name, it becomes real in a different way. The incident was later mentioned during a public session at the Mansion House on the 9th of January 1838, where the Lord Mayor of London, Sir John Cowan, addressed a flood of anonymous complaints regarding a ghost or devil terrorising the suburbs. The descriptions begin to solidify, not because the figure is consistent, but because the stories start to influence each other. Spring Hill Jack is now said to be tall, thin, wearing a tight-fitting suit, sometimes described as white oilskin or a dark cloak. His face? Devilish, with glowing eyes, sometimes red, sometimes like fire. And the hands, always the hands, ending in metal claws. But the most famous feature is not how he looks, it's what he can do. He can leap, not just run, not just jump, but launch himself into the air in ways that seem impossible, over walls, across roads, onto rooftops, and then disappear. On the 20th of February 1838, one of the most documented encounters, a young woman named Jane Alsop is at home. There is a violent knocking at the door. A man outside claims to be a police officer. He says they have caught Spring Hill Jack and they need a light. Already something is wrong. But the authority in the voice is enough. She brings a candle, and when she opens the door, the man steps forward, throws back his cloak, and reveals something unnatural. A tight, strange outfit. A face that doesn't look right. And then he attacks. He grabs her, tears at her clothes, scratches her with clawed hands. And then comes the detail that will define the legend. He breathes something into her face, a blue flame. Not fire in the normal sense, something chemical, something unnatural. Her family rushes to help, pulling her back inside. And the attacker doesn't run. He leaps and vanishes into the night. The incident occurred at her father's residence in Bearbinder Lane, located between the villages of Bow and Old Alford, and Jane suffered severe lacerations to her neck, shoulders and arms, caused by the assailant's metallic claws. Her dress was nearly torn off, and a significant amount of her hair was wrenched out. Police investigated, but ultimately concluded Jane was so terrified she had mistaken her attacker for the legendary figure. Officers suggested it was a drunken frolic. How little did they know. 9 days later, 28th of February 1838, another name enters the story, Lucy Scales. Walking with her sister in Limehouse, a man approaches, calm, controlled, almost ordinary, until he raises something to his mouth and releases flame, blue again, bright enough to blind. Lucy collapses, convulsing, unable to see. And the man? He doesn't chase. He doesn't attack further. He simply turns and walks away. The attack took place in Green Dragon Alley, a narrow passage in Limehouse, East London. Unlike the Allsop case, Lucy's assailant did not attempt to claw or physically grab her. Yet later sensationalist retellings often conflate the two, adding claws or leaping to the Scales incident that were not in her original deposition. This attack, however, thanks to the press, solidified the public's fear of Spring-Heeled Jack as a serial predator. By now, Spring-Heeled Jack is no longer just a rumour. He is a presence, a known threat, a headline. The attacks share patterns. Always women targeted, clothing torn, claws used. There's no theft and no clear motive. And always the escape. The leap, the impossible exit. But something else is happening too, because as the reports spread, they begin to multiply. And when stories multiply fast enough, they stop being just reports and start becoming something else. A legend. By the end of early 1838, London is no longer asking, is something happening? It's asking, what is it? A man? A monster? A prank? Or something the city itself has created? From fear, darkness, and imagination? Because what comes next doesn't slow down. It spreads across London, across Britain. And the figure known as Spring-Heeled Jack becomes something far more dangerous than a single attacker. He becomes unstoppable. By the time February 1838 draws to a close, something has shifted. The attacks are no longer isolated. They are connected, not by evidence, but by story. Newspapers begin to report them side by side. Details bleed into one another. Descriptions sharpen, and something dangerous happens. People start to expect him, and when people expect something, they begin to see it. Victorian London was one of the first cities where fear could spread faster than fact. Newspapers were everywhere, cheap, accessible, hungry for attention. And Spring-Heeled Jack was perfect material. He had everything: violence, mystery, supernatural suggestion, respectable victims, and most importantly, he could not be caught. The public hysteria surrounding Spring-Heeled Jack was officially ignited on the 9th of January 1838, when the Lord Mayor of London, Sir John Cowan, revealed an anonymous letter during a public session at the Mansion House. It describes a group of young men, aristocrats, playing a game, a wager of £5,000. They are said to be disguising themselves as ghosts, as monsters, as something inhuman, and attacking women for sport. The letter suggests money is involved, that whoever frightens the most people wins. It is a compelling theory because it explains something important: the lack of robbery, the theatricality, and the focus on fear over harm. But it also introduces something darker, because if this is true, then Spring-Heeled Jack is not one man, he is many, and they are enjoying it. Initially, Sir John Cowan expressed significant scepticism, stating he believed the reports were the greatest exaggerations and perhaps even non-existent. However, as the session progressed, other attendees came forward to confirm similar stories from Kensington, Hammersmith, and Ealing. Confronted with these accounts, Cowan's stance shifted. He instructed the police to hunt down the vicious nuisance and ordered that any culprits be arrested regardless of their social standing. After the Jane Alsop attack, a suspect emerges, a man named Thomas Milbank, a carpenter, drunk, boastful. He reportedly claims in a pub that he is Spring-Heeled Jack, and for a moment it seems like the case might end there. But then it falls apart. Milbank cannot explain the fire, he cannot replicate the behaviour, and more importantly, the victim herself does not identify him as the attacker. He is released, and Spring-Heeled Jack becomes something even harder to contain, because now there is proof of something unsettling. People are willing to pretend to be him. Once a legend reaches a certain point, it stops belonging to the original events. It becomes a tool, and Spring-Heeled Jack becomes exactly that. Across London and beyond, reports begin to surface of men in disguises, men in masks, men in costumes designed to frighten. Some wear animal skins, some add horns. Some use mechanical tricks to appear more terrifying, and in some cases, they are caught. In 1847, a man named Captain Finch is convicted after attacking women while dressed in a bizarre costume. This matters because it confirms something crucial. At least some of the Jacks are human, deliberate, calculated, and exploiting fear that already exists. Why women? The pattern is clear from the beginning. Spring-Heeled Jack targets women, usually alone, usually at night, usually in vulnerable positions. And this is not incidental. Victorian society placed women in a paradox. They were expected to be visible, to move through public space, but they were not protected within it. Servants especially had to travel between homes, across commons, through poorly lit streets, and when something attacked them, their testimony was often questioned, their fear dismissed. So when multiple women began reporting similar encounters, something changed, because even in a society that doubted them, consistency is hard to ignore. The most persistent feature of the legend remains the most debated: the leaps. Witnesses describe jumping over walls, clearing rooftops, and crossing wide distances in a single bound. To a modern listener, it sounds impossible, and in many ways, it probably is. But perception matters more than physics. At night, in fear, distances stretch, movements blur, and something that might be a skilled jump becomes something supernatural. There were theories even at the time. spring-loaded boots, mechanical assistance, early forms of elastic or India rubber, but no device was ever found, no mechanism recovered, and no attacker ever demonstrated such ability under controlled conditions. So the Leaps remain what they likely always were, a combination of athleticism, exaggeration, and fear. By the 1840s, Spring Hill Jack is no longer confined to London. Reports emerge from the Midlands, the Black Country, even parts of the countryside far removed from the original attacks. The pattern repeats. A figure appears, startles or attacks, escapes with impossible speed, and always the name follows, Spring Hill Jack. Even when the details differ, even when the attacker looks different, even when the circumstances don't quite match, because by now the name is more powerful than the truth. Decades later, the 1870s, Spring Hill Jack appears again, this time in a new setting, a military garrison at Aldershot, and the witnesses are not servants, not vulnerable civilians, but soldiers, men trained to observe, to respond, to act under pressure. They report something extraordinary, a figure approaching sentries at night, calmly, silently. When challenged, he does not flee. Instead, he strikes, slapping one guard across the face, cold and natural. And then he leaps across barriers, across distances no one expects. Shots are fired, and they claim he is unaffected. Whether this is true or not, the impact is the same. The legend has survived and adapted. Something else begins to change. The tone. Early reports are filled with fear, but later ones, they start to contain something else. Amusement. Spring Hill Jack becomes less of a threat and more of a spectacle, a prankster, a trickster, something to be laughed at, as well as feared. And that shift matters, because it marks a moment where the legend becomes self-aware. People are no longer just reporting him, they are participating. By the late 19th century, Spring Hill Jack is no longer one thing. He is a rumour, a disguise, a story, a weapon, a way to frighten, a way to entertain, a way to explain something that doesn't quite make sense. And somewhere in all of that, the original truth is buried. Because when too many people become the monster, you lose track of where it began. And what remains is not a man, but a myth that refuses to die. By the time Spring Hill Jack reaches the end of the 19th century, something unusual has happened. He hasn't disappeared, and he hasn't been caught, and he hasn't even been explained. He has changed. What began as a series of violent encounters has become something far more durable. It's a story, and stories don't need evidence to survive. They need memory. One of the most cited final sightings comes from Liverpool in 1904. Witnesses claim to see a figure moving across rooftops, leaping, gliding, vanishing between buildings. The description is familiar, too familiar, because by this point, Spring Hill Jack is no longer being discovered. He is being recognized. And that distinction matters, because once a legend becomes widely known, people don't just encounter it. They interpret things through it. A shadow becomes a figure. A movement becomes a leap. A stranger becomes Jack. The 1904 Liverpool sightings were located primarily in the Everton district. The account marked the end of a nearly 70-year cycle of reports that began in London in 1837. The crowds reportedly gathered to watch a strange figure leaping between rooftops and perform extraordinary bounds from the pavement to housetops. Interestingly, this specific account also involved mysterious missiles being thrown at a house with no visible agency, causing the terrified tenants to flee. If there was ever a single man behind the earliest attacks, one name comes up more than any other. Henry de la Poix Beresford, the third Marquess of Waterford, a nobleman, wealthy, well-connected, and known for something very specific: violent, drunken pranks. He had a reputation for breaking into homes, attacking strangers, and causing chaos for amusement. He was in London around the time of the early incidents, an aristocrat with money, time, and immunity, someone who could afford elaborate disguises, someone unlikely to face consequences. But there is a problem. There is no proof, no arrest, no confession, and no direct link to the attacks. Just a pattern of behaviour that feels close enough. And that's where the theory remains. Tempting, but unproven. Here is a bit more information on the Marquess. His official title was Lord Henry Beresford, 3rd Marquess of Waterford. He was a notorious Irish nobleman who was the ultimate 19th century lad, known for extreme hedonism, brawling, and destructive practical jokes. An example of his antics would be in 1837. Waterford and his friends literally painted the doors, windows, and a toll gate in Melton Mowbray with red paint after a night of heavy drinking. This is widely cited as the origin of the phrase, painting the town red. Other than the names mentioned previously, it is thought that perhaps another explanation emerges from the chaos itself. Not one attacker, but several. A loose group, young men, possibly wealthy, possibly bored, testing limits, feeding off each other. Because once Spring-Heeled Jack became a known figure, it created an opportunity to imitate, to escalate, to participate in something larger than themselves. And this explains something the single suspect theory cannot: the variation. Different descriptions, different behaviours, different locations, all tied together by a shared identity. It is impossible to separate Spring-Heeled Jack from the media that sustained him. Victorian newspapers didn't just report events, they shaped them. Stories were expanded, they were embellished, and they were repeated. And the more people read about Spring-Heeled Jack, the more he became real to them. Even when the details didn't match, even when logic faltered. Because fear doesn't need consistency, it just needs recognition. Then the legend moves into fiction. Cheap serialized stories, the penny dreadfuls pick him up, and they transform him. Spring-Heeled Jack becomes a villain, a demon, a supernatural force. But in some versions, he was something else entirely. A hero, a masked avenger, a misunderstood figure. A man using fear as a weapon against others. This is where the image solidifies. The horns, the cloak, the glowing eyes. Not from eyewitnesses, but from storytelling. And once fiction defines a character, it becomes difficult to separate it from reality. One of the strangest elements of the legend is the fire. Witnesses repeatedly described blue flames or white flames, something expelled from the mouth. To Victorians, this suggested something supernatural, but there are other possibilities. Chemical tricks? Alcohol vapor? Possibly early forms of ignition? Or just something simpler? Exaggeration, because once one person describes fire, others begin to see it too. Memory adapts and fear fills the gaps. and what might have been a flash becomes a weapon. What was he really? Let's strip away the legend, remove the exaggeration, and what remains? A pattern. A man or men who targeted women, used disguise, relied on surprise, avoided robbery, and escaped quickly. That is not supernatural. It is behavioral. It suggests predation, performance, control, and perhaps most importantly, enjoyment, because these were not efficient attacks. They were theatrical, designed to shock, to imprint, to be remembered. Most criminals are forgotten, even violent ones, but Spring Hill Jack survives. Why? Because he was never just a criminal. He was an idea, a figure that could be reused, reimagined, reinterpreted. He fits into multiple roles: monster, prankster, aristocrat, demon, vigilante. And because he fits so many narratives, he never settles into just one. Today, most historians agree on one thing. Spring Hill Jack was not a single individual. He was a convergence of real attacks, copycats, media amplification, and public fear. And once those elements combined, they created something self-sustaining, a legend that no longer needed a source. Spring Hill Jack never needed to be caught, because he was never fully real in the way we expect. And yet, he was real enough. Real enough for the women who were attacked, real enough for the fear that spread, real enough for a city to believe that something was out there, something faster, something stronger, something that could appear and disappear before you understood what you were seeing. And maybe that's the final truth of Spring Hill Jack. Not that he existed, but that he could exist in a city like London at a time like that, where darkness, fear, and imagination collided and created something that could leap not just over walls, but into history itself. This has been The Eclectic, a story not just about a man, but about how fear travels, how stories grow, and how sometimes the most powerful figures are the ones we create together. If you found this story compelling, please follow, rate, and share the show. It helps others discover these deep dives into the stranger corners of history. And if you have a family legend of your own, half truth, half ghost story, I'd love to hear it. And as always, stay curious, stay questioning, stay eclectic.